Thank you, Brother Chairman, and my dear brothers and sisters in the Lord Jesus Christ. Well then, this morning, Proverbs 26, as our Chairman has intimated to the title, How to Discern Character. This is the key to the understanding of this particular chapter. And so firstly, just a break-up then of the chapter as we have it in front of us. Verses 1 to 12, the useless fool. The useless fool. And we stress the word useless because the king will find that these are the people that are unreliable in terms of being able to entrust them with responsibility in the kingdom. In verses 13 to 16, we have the hopeless sluggard. The hopeless sluggard. In verses 17 to 22, we have the meddlesome troublemaker. The meddlesome troublemaker. And finally, in verses 23 to 28, we have the hateful hypocrite. So you see, the key to this chapter is understanding and discerning the character of those who may prove to be problems in the kingdom. The king needs to understand all of these, doesn't he, if he's to guide the kingdom wisely. You know, I think there's an historical basis to the spirit, if you like, of this chapter. If you come back to the first of Kings and to the third chapter, remember this episode in the life of Solomon. The first of Kings, chapter 3, and to that evening in Solomon's life when Almighty God appeared to him in Gibeon by dream, as the record tells us. The first of Kings, chapter 3, and reading from verse 5. Now, you see what it says here. It says, in Gibeon, Yahweh appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask what I shall give thee. And Solomon said, thou hast showed unto thy servant David my father great mercy. And now, verse 7, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father. And I am but a little child, I know not how to go out or come in, and thy servant is in the midst of thy people which thou hast chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered or counted for multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people? And the speech pleased the Lord, that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said unto him, verse 12, behold, I have done according to thy words, and lo, I have given thee a wise and understanding heart. So discernment of character, the ability to discern character, was the very thing that Solomon had asked for, wasn't it? And you know, in this chapter, the test came shortly afterwards, because you see in verse 16, we're told that then there came two women that were harlots unto the king and stood before him. And they each had a story concerning a problem. And you see, the king needed to discern the character of the two women in order that he might give good and wise judgment. And verse 23 tells us, then said the king, the one saith, this is my son that liveth, and thy son is dead. And the other saith, nay, but thy son is dead, and my son is the living. And the king said, bring me a sword, and they brought a sword, and the king said, divide the living child in two, and give the half to the one and half to the other. And then spake the woman, whose the living child was, unto the king, for her bowels yearned upon her son. And she said, O my lord, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. But the other said, let it be neither mine nor thine, but divideth. And then the king answered and said, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. She is the mother thereof, and all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged. And they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment. Oh yes, Solomon knew how to discern character. And that's what I think, you see, Proverbs 26 is all about, is that understanding. By the way, a brother said to me the other day, and I think rightly so, is that I gave earlier some examples of how these Proverbs are outworked in the life of Solomon, and also in the life of Hezekiah. I didn't want you to think that only some verses have application to Solomon, and not to Hezekiah, and that other verses only have application to Hezekiah and not to Solomon. Indeed, we would conclude that all of these chapters have application to Solomon since he wrote them, and all of these verses have application to Hezekiah since he copied them. And we hope that all of these verses have application to ourselves if we likewise aspire to kingship. Now, again, because of the sheer breadth of material in these chapters, we can't look at the whole of Proverbs 26. So we've got to decide what to do. But what I'm going to do is just touch on a couple of illustrations from the section on fools, verses 1 to 12, and then we're going to spend a little more time examining in perhaps greater detail the sluggard of verses 13 to 16 and the meddlesome troublemaker of verses 17 to 22. And then if we have time, to touch briefly on the hypocrite of the final verses. So the fool, first of all. You see what it says in verse 1 of Proverbs 26. As snow in summer and as rain in harvest, so honour is not seemly for a fool. Now the fact is that we're told that snow is a God-given mantle for the earth in the winter time. Job 37 verse 6. It insulates the earth. It leads to the bud of springtime. There's something wonderful about the snow in its due and proper time. But when either rain or snow come out of season, they're not only incongruous, they are in fact damaging. And the lesson of the proverb is that the richest blessings lose their value when they are unsuitably bestowed, and so honour bestowed upon a fool is not only incongruous, but in fact is damaging. A wise ruler does not elevate such people to positions of responsibility. It is inappropriate to do so. By the way, the fool of these verses, I think we tend to think that fools are, well, what do we think a fool is today? We think of a fool as being perhaps deficient in his thinking. The one thing that we must know about the fool of these verses is he has no problem with intelligence. He may be stubborn, he may be irreverent, he may be silly, he may be complacent, he may be insolent, but he's not dumb. His problem is not intelligence, his problem is attitude. The problem of the fool of these verses is the problem of attitude. And a wise king has to learn to discern these particular characteristics. Two reasons, by the way, why the king must discern character. Firstly, so that he can recognize those individuals who may be detrimental to the good of the kingdom. And unfortunately, this is needful even in ecclesial life. And secondly, so that in recognizing the characteristics of these people, the king may learn to purge those particular faults from his own life. Not just to recognize it in others, but to repudiate those principles in his own life, so that he might be a wise king. Now take verse 6 by way of illustration. He that sendeth a message by the hand of a fool cutteth off the feet and drinketh damage. So this is quite different to the faithful messenger of chapter 25, verse 13, isn't it? This fool is so incompetent, he makes so many mistakes that the message is absolutely and finally lost. It never gets through, it never arrives. The words get changed. So the lesson, of course, of the verse is that important business is only entrusted by the king to persons who are worthy of that responsibility. We need to exercise care that we've chosen the right person for the execution of the right responsibility. By the way, when it says cut off the feet in the verse, whose feet are cut off? The fool's feet or the king's feet? The answer is the king's feet. The sense of the verse is that the king cuts off his own feet. In other words, the damage and harm comes to the one who used the fool in the first place. Who would think of cutting one's feet off? And yet one does, if one entrusts responsibility to those who are in fact unworthy of the position. The word damage, by the way, with the alteration of one letter in the Hebrew, is the same as the word poison, as found in Job chapter 6 and verse 4. You just don't do this, says the Proverbs. No more than drinking poison would you entrust responsibility to people like this. What about verse 9? As a thorn goeth up into the hand of a drunkard, so is a parable in the mouth of the fool. In other words, it's no more fitting for a fool to handle a wise speech than for a drunkard to handle a thorn bush. You know what the drunkard does? You see, what happens is that the thorn goes into his hand and pierces him. Well, so does a fool when he's endeavouring to give forth parables of wisdom. The very words that he speaks, as it were, pierce the hypocrisy of his own life. But just like the drunkard, he's entirely unaware that he's been damaged, entirely insensible of the wound that he has inflicted on himself. There is nothing more inspiring in the truth, brothers and sisters, than a word of exhortation or a word of comfort from a brother or sister where you just know that the words they speak are the principles they live by. And there's nothing more offensive or unbecoming than a word of exhortation or a lesson from one who offends in that very same matter themselves. A parable in the mouth of a fool, like a thorn in the hand of a drunkard. No, these people are not suitable, are they, for responsibility in the kingdom. So a king's got to exercise wisdom in that regard. Now, let's come to the slothful man. Oh, this is an interesting person indeed. Now, you see what it says, verse 13. The slothful man saith, there is a lion in the way, a lion in the street. As the door turneth upon his hinges, so that the slothful man upon his bed, the slothful hideth his hand in his bosom, it grieveth him to bring it to his mouth. The sluggard, verse 16, is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason. Now, the first thing that we want to notice is you see the word sluggard in verse 16. That's the same word translated slothful in the previous 4 verses. So really, you see, it's all about the same person all the way through. Why the change was made in the authorized version to sluggard, I'm not sure, but it is in fact the same Hebrew word all the way through this particular section. So what does the slothful man say in verse 13? What we're going to find is that each of these verses marks a particular aspect of the problem of slothfulness. I believe that these are caricatures, by the way. What's a caricature? Well, it's sort of like a mental sketch, isn't it? But it's exaggerated for effect. You see, there aren't really many people who would sort of use the excuse of verse 13, really, is there, about a lion in the streets. And we haven't really met anyone who's quite as securely attached to their bed as a door is to its hinges. Verse 14. It's a caricature. It's a deliberate sketch to exaggerate for effect. But the really worrying thing about this, brothers and sisters, is that by the time we come to the end of this section, we suddenly realize that it may just be ourselves of whom the caricature speaks. So let us have a look. Now, verse 13, you see, they're all slightly different, and wonderfully so. Now, this verse says, the slothful man saith, there is a lion in the way, a lion in the streets. Now, you see, the saying of the slothful man on this occasion is designed to justify his inaction. His real problem is a reluctance to begin work. And therefore, he becomes absolutely ingenious at inventing excuses and at seeing dangers which actually don't exist. In fact, his story gets better as it goes on. He starts by saying, there is a lion in the way. And that grows to become, there's a lion in the streets. Now you see, the word for lion here is different on the 2 occasions it's used. The first time, the word lion, shakal, means to roar. But the second word, ari, means a lion in the sense of the violence of the lion. So first of all, one simply hears the growling of a lion outside. But before he's finished his story, it's a violent, fierce, ferocious lion that we must avoid at all costs. Now, why does he say that it's in the streets? Well, if we come back to Proverbs 22, we have, remember, a very similar proverb that's already been used, and I think it helps our understanding. Proverbs 22 and verse 13. Now, notice how this adds something to the spirit of the proverb of chapter 26. In 26 it says, there is a lion in the way, a lion in the streets. But chapter 22 verse 13 adds this point. The slothful man saith, there is a lion without, I shall be slain in the streets. So you see, what the slothful man is really saying is, I better not go to work today. Because the moment I step outside, there's danger. So I better stay at home. So what's the spirit of this particular verse in Proverbs 22 verse 13? I think the spirit is the man or the woman who has an inability to start anything in life. They can't start anything in life. There's a lion in the streets. Have a look at Proverbs 20 verse 4. A couple of other references that show the spirit of this person. Proverbs 20 verse 4. You see, this is one of the crucial problems of slothfulness, an inability to start anything. 24 says, the sluggard will not plough by reason of the cold. And another one, an excellent one, in chapter 21 and verse 25. This is a lovely one, really. Read from the authorized version, in all its eloquence, Proverbs 21:25, the desire of the slothful killeth him, for his hands refuse to labour. He looks down at them. He wishes they would do something. And you know that the strange thing he says is that they just won't get started. They refuse to labour. So you see, the problem of Proverbs 26 and verse 13 is the person who's unable to start anything in life. And of course the problem is, before we laugh too long or too loud, is there anything in life, in the truth, that you've ever said, I must do that? And yet you never have. I must mark up that chapter. I must begin prayers with my wife. I must make sure that we do the readings every night with our children. I must make sure that we spend time every week to read a portion of a book together, that we might share time as husband and wife. I must make a note that I will go and visit one of the elderly in the ecclesia every month from now. I must start this or that. And somehow we never have. There was a lion in the streets, wasn't there? Now, what about the next verse, verse 14? Because you see, this is a different problem this time. Verse 14 of Proverbs 26 says, as the door turneth upon his hinges, so doth the slothful upon his bed. See, the thing with doors is that doors are useful things. When they turn upon the hinge, they do several different things, don't they? They either provide a sense of privacy, or they help to keep the wind or the elements out, or they can open to allow people in, to be welcomed into the room. At least a door turning upon its hinges does something useful, but the man that turns upon his bed doesn't actually achieve very much at all. And you see that the proverb here talks about the one who moves around, but funny enough, he never actually makes any progress in life. I think the spirit of this proverb is an inability to progress. You see, verse 13 is an inability to start anything. Verse 14 is the inability to progress in life. He moves, but somehow he never actually gets anywhere. He never actually leaves his place. Difficulties hinder him from going forward, and conscience keeps him from going backwards, and therefore as a door upon its hinges, where he was one day, 1 year, there he is the next year, just swinging back and forth, still securely bolted to his own problem. What's the slothful's problem? Verse 14. Well, it's his bed, really, isn't it? Isn't the bed equivalent to the man's problem or the woman's problem? They can't ever quite escape from it. So you see, this is the person that somehow is unable to make any development in the truth. One visits them, one sees them, and if one came back 10 years later, you'd find pretty much the same person, still swinging back and forth with the same difficulties. They've never progressed in terms of spiritual development. Not us, we cry. So let us run a little test. Now, is there anything in your life a problem? Fortunately, this is a matter of self-examination. Is there any problem in your life that was actually there last year? A problem with character or attitude, a difficulty, a weakness you have, that you know you have, a besetting sin. Now, was that same problem there 5 years ago? And you're still dealing with it, struggling with it, coping with it, trying to move on and away from it? Is there anything in a person's life that you might confess actually been there for 10 years? And you see, all of a sudden, we find that it might be us that's bolted to the bed, unable to progress in the truth and to leave behind those things that are detracting from our spiritual development. Oh yes, I think we all suffer from this, don't we? What about verse 15? Now, this is a cracker. The slothful hideth his hand in his bosom. But that's actually not a good translation. First of all, the word hide is translated by a number of other translations as buries. He buries his hand. But he doesn't bury his hand in his bosom. The word bosom here is actually one of a set of Hebrew words used to describe ordinary household utensils. And this particular word, we believe, means a bowl or a dish. The same word is, well, in fact, this word's only found 3 times. It's found here, it's found in chapter 19, verse 24 of Proverbs, which is actually a very similar proverb, and we'll come to it shortly. And it's found in the 2nd of Kings, chapter 21 and verse 13. A brother got caught out, by the way, on that chapter. A brother at a Bible school was handed a tea towel from a sister and invited to share in the washing up of the dishes. And he said, that's not a man's job. And she said, oh yes it is. He said, if you can show me from Scripture that a man ought to dry the dishes, I will do so. And she quoted to him the 2nd of Kings 21 verse 13, which says, as a man wipeth a dish, turning it upside down. Now the word dish in that verse is the same word translated bosom here in verse 15. It's a little bit like the Lord's words in Matthew 26 verse 23. Remember, he that dippeth his hand with me in the dish. So you see, what it's saying is that the slothful man buries his hand in the dish. The food, the bowl of food, his hand, well, he's able to bury it. He doesn't just dip it, he buries it. But the problem is, says the proverb, he's just too tired to actually get it back up to his mouth again. This is exhaustion indeed. Come and have a look at chapter 12, verse 27, which is a similar proverb. Now, you see, Proverbs 12 and verse 27 says, the slothful man roasteth not that which he took in hunting. So this is quite similar, isn't it? You see, this man is so slothful that he's enjoyed the chase, he's followed the animal, he's chased the animal, he's successfully caught the animal, and then at the very moment when he ought now to cook it and eat it and enjoy the fruits of his labours, he finds he's too tired to do it. The man of Proverbs 26, well, he's got the cooking done, he's got the food prepared, but he's unable to get his hand back to his mouth. As one writer has said, and I rather like this, the rare effort of beginning something has just been too much. So what's the lesson, do you think, of Proverbs 26 verse 15? And the lesson is this. This is the person who is unable to finish anything, isn't it? Verse 13 is the inability to start. Verse 14 is the inability to progress. And verse 15 is the inability to finish anything. Now, do we have in our Bibles a book that we've begun to mark, a project that we've begun that isn't quite finished? Yes, I think most of us find that there are things in life that we've begun with great zeal and great diligence and great enthusiasm. And just when we got to that moment of time when the final effort was needed to bring the matter to a conclusion, we gave it up and we left it alone and we walked off and we did something else and we never quite finished it off. The slothful man is unable to bring his hand back to his mouth. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 8 says, "Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof." And there's a principle of life and the truth that we must finish that which we've begun. There ought to be a conclusion, a maturing of our labours to fruition. So, and now verse 16, the most dangerous thing of all as far as the slothful person is concerned. Because, you see, it says here, the slothful is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason. So you see, to add to his existing flaws, the real problem with the slothful person is that they convince themselves that they're not really like this at all. They convince themselves that this is not really them. This must be somebody else. It couldn't possibly be them. In fact, so convinced are they that these portraits of the slothful are not related to them, then that they are wiser in that than 7 men that can render a reason. Now, why 7 men? Well, isn't 7 here used as the number of completeness? So you see, in other words, he rationalizes his laziness, and all arguments, the arguments of 7 men, all complete evidence to the contrary is brushed aside, rebutted, ignored as being absolutely unthinkable. He could not possibly be like this. So you see, what the slothful person says is this. Verse 13. I'm not a shirker. I'm a realist. Verse 14. I'm not lazy. I'm just cautious. Verse 15. I'm not slow. I just object to being pushed. Verse 16. I'm not indolent. I'm a person that knows their mind. And somehow it's all explained away. So the king must not only watch out for those that are slothful in the kingdom, but needs to discern the characteristics so that he can avoid it in his own life. And now the meddlesome troublemaker of verses 17 to 22. Now this is a different person altogether. Now you see, the common element of these verses 17 to 22, is that although they're different, they're quite different people that are expressed in these verses, the common element is that their work and their influence is negative and destructive. That's the binding thread here. Their work and their influence is negative and destructive. They are people to be watched out for. Now take verse 17, the meddlesome troublemaker himself. He that passeth by and meddleth with strife belonging not to him is like one that taketh a dog by the ears. So the obvious idea, the obvious spirit of the verse is the spirit of interference, isn't it? The spirit of interfering. The Amplified Bible says, he who passing by stops to meddle with strife that is not his business. So you see, he was really actually walking by, and he stops right in the middle of something and turns aside and interferes with something that wasn't his to interfere with in the first place. The Jerusalem Bible says interfering in the quarrels of others. But the word meddleth here is actually, well, I think it actually means more than that, because it's only found on 3 occasions in the particular tense that it's found here. Now, let me show you the other 2, because they're both in Proverbs. In chapter 14, we have, here are the 3 occasions where this word meddleth is found in this particular tense in the divine record. Only 3 times. Firstly, Proverbs 14 and verse 16. A wise man feareth and departeth from evil, but the fool rageth. Now you see that word rageth? That's our word. Rageth. Now what does that imply, by the way? It's a word that implies not just interference, but emotion, emotional involvement. He rages about the matter. The person is emotionally involved in this thing. Again in chapter 20 and verse 2. So Proverbs 20 verse 2 says, the fear of a king is as the roaring of a lion, whoso provoketh him to anger. And the words provoke to anger is the same Hebrew word used here. So it conveys the sense of emotional involvement, not just interference, but that the passions have been aroused. And likewise here now, in Proverbs 26 and verse 17, we have the third occasion that the word is translated, and here it's translated as meddleth. Although you'll notice in the authorized version margin that it says is enraged. So Rotherham says, a passerby who gives vent to his wrath over a quarrel that is not his. He's emotionally involved in the matter, and yet it wasn't his business to begin with. So what's the parallel of the verse here? This business of the dog and the ears and all that sort of stuff. Well, I think firstly that the outburst of this person's emotion is like seizing and shaking a dog by the ears. And secondly, what sort of response is he going to get? Well, have you ever tried taking a dog by the ears? Shaking him by the ears. And this isn't any ordinary sort of dog. These are the dogs of Israel, the desert dogs. They were violent, nasty creatures, says the Psalms. They were snapping, biting, ferocious creatures. You just don't take this sort of thing by the ears. And the snarling response of such a dog would answer to the sort of response that a meddler would get when they interfere in a matter that's not theirs. In other words, they're lucky if they don't get their head bitten off. Now, you see, this happens in ecclesial life sometimes, doesn't it? You know, you see a problem or a difficulty either with a family or with a couple or with this or that, and you think, I'm just itching to go and deal with that problem and sort it out. Only trouble is it's not your business. Well, this is the person that forgets that it's not their business, and they get all fired up with passion and they steam into the situation. And the point is of the verse, of course, is that to interfere in the moment of irritation will tend to kindle rather than extinguish the problem. Wise kings know not to do that. Wise rulers understand that there is a time in life, in the truth, where even though you can see that a problem exists, you need to wait on the Father to provide the right opportunity to deal with the matter. And sometimes, you know, it's enormously frustrating, but it's necessary to. Sometimes there are things that you see and you just wish you could do something, and you know that in the Father's wisdom you ought not to. You wait. You wait on the Father. And all of a sudden an opportunity crops up, a situation arises whereby finally you're able to deal with that situation. Might be some considerable time later, and it's handled beautifully and to the honour of the Father, because you learnt not to interfere at the wrong time. Yes, we've got to watch out for that spirit of meddling. What about verse 18? Now, this is a different person altogether. In fact, verses 18 and 19 need to be read together. This is not a meddler now. This is somebody else altogether. This is the jester in ecclesial life, the ecclesial jokester. Now, what does he do? Well, verse 18 says, as a madman who casteth firebrands, arrows, and death, so is the man that deceiveth his neighbour, and saith, am I not in sport? The word madman here means to be insane. And the picture of verse 18 is this dramatic picture of the frenzied actions of someone who's, well, Moffat says it's like a lunatic who lets fly. Imagine this person running down the streets, shooting off these firebrands and arrows, and people saying, get out, look, there's a madman in the streets, look out, and there's arrows going all over the place. As he comes laughing down the street, he's crazy. But verse 19 says, so is the man. So the man of verse 19 is compared with the insane destruction of the madman of verse 18. Now, what does the person of verse 19 do? Well, it says that they deceived their neighbour. Now, that word deceive is actually very interesting. In fact, every time that it's used in the same tense here as this proverb, it invariably relates to somebody who is passing themselves off as somebody else or as something else. It's the word used when Jacob wakes up in the morning and finds that he hasn't married Rachel at all. He's now married Leah. And he was deceived, Genesis 29:25. It's the word used in Joshua 9, verse 22, when Joshua finds he's been deceived by the men with the mouldy bread and the rotten sandals, the Gibeonites. It's the word used in the 1st of Samuel 19 and verse 17, when the men of Saul burst in to take David and they find there's actually a teraphim in the bed. Remember? That wasn't David at all. Something passing itself off as David, but it wasn't really him. And the lesson is that every time you'll find this word used, what you'll find is that the joke or the deception is at the expense of the neighbour. I think that's the key idea here. The joke or the deception is always at the expense of the neighbour. He's the one who suffers. In other words, he's the one who gets hit by the arrow of verse 18. So you see, these are the sort of jokes that happen in ecclesial life about other brethren. Oh, ha, ha, ha. How funny they are. But it's never about the person who says the joke, is it? It's always about somebody else in the meeting. Jolly good fun. But it's not really funny, is it? Because it actually hurts people. Come and have a look at Proverbs 10 and verse 23. This is the lesson, isn't it? Proverbs 10 verse 23, it is as sport to a fool to do mischief, but a man of understanding hath wisdom. Wise people don't joke like this in ecclesial life, because you see, the spirit of this person in Proverbs 26 and verses 18 and 19, well, let's come back to it and see what it says. I think the parallel of the idea is, the Jerusalem Bible says, so is the man who lies to his neighbour and then says it was all a joke. He's like the madman in effect, isn't he? His effect is the same as the madman. He spreads hurt and damage by joking, just as the madman does by frenzy. They're both the same in effect. They cause hurt and damage. But I tell you what, the brother who jokes or jests concerning his neighbour is actually more responsible, isn't he? Because he's thoroughly aware of what he's doing. The madman isn't. He's insane. But the jester knows full well the damage that he causes. Sly wit and innuendo at the expense of others. This is the person who causes trouble in ecclesial life by mischief making. Ephesians chapter 5 has a good observation on this matter. Ephesians 5, 2-4. And walk in love, as Christ also hath loved us, and hath given himself for us an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savour. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not be once named among you as become of saints, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. Now that's not a good spirit in ecclesial life, and it doesn't help in any way to advance the cause of the truth. So back to Proverbs 26 then, and now verse 20. And what a marvellous proverb this is. Where no wood is, there the fire goeth out, so where there is no talebearer, the strife ceaseth. You know, I've always marvelled at this proverb since I was very much younger. And I think the thing that's marvellous about this proverb is, have you ever stared into the dying flames of a fire as it quietens down? It's a lovely thing, isn't it? Wonderful thing to watch. It's warm and comforting, and it's one of those inviting moments as the dark of night creeps on and the fire slowly dies down before we go to bed. Would we have seen a spiritual lesson in that? And see, the thing in life is that there are so many obvious, ordinary, everyday, commonplace things in life that we actually don't see spiritual lessons in. But the great wisdom of Solomon was that he saw spiritual lessons in ordinary things. So he says, where there is no wood, there the fire goeth out. Yes. So, where there is no talebearer, the strife ceaseth. Oh, yes. Now there's a powerful lesson drawn from an ordinary thing of daily life. Spiritual mindedness is all about being able to see spiritual lessons in ordinary life. Now here the strife is the fire. But the talebearer, of course, is the one who provides the fuel. Now what does a talebearer do? Well, they fan the flames of contention in ecclesial life by passing on details which become fuel to the fire. Actually, you know what the word talebearer really means in the Hebrew? It actually means the whisperer. The whisperer. You see, the thing with whisperers in ecclesial life is that they rarely talk to the person that they are talking about. They're always busy talking to others. You know, I've actually seen this happen in ecclesial life. Something will crop up, and after the meeting you'll see a couple of brethren disappear off into the corner, and and then one of those will go, and you'll see one of those brethren go to another corner, and three people will go together, and you see it move. You see the whisperer moving around the ecclesia, blowing on the flames, and before you know it, you've got an ecclesial controversy on your hands because the talebearer's been busy adding fuel to the fire. And worse still, of course, those that are foolish enough to listen to the talebearer, who help also to ensure that the fire grows. So how do we quench the strife, says Solomon? Simple. Remove the whisperer, and the fire will go out. So how do we do that? Well, of course, we can't throw them out of the meeting, but we can stop the whisperer, him or her, in their tracks. We can ask them to produce their authority. We can face them with the subject of their tales. This is the lesson again of chapter 25, isn't it? Verses 8 to 10, about debating the cause with the neighbour yourself, privately. If people come to you with whispered gossip about other people, don't allow them to carry on speaking. Stop them in their tracks and say, I don't want to hear. Only then will the strife cease. Wise rulers know that not only are these people to be carefully watched, but they must never themselves indulge in such a fleshly evil. And quite different to that is the spirit of the man in verse 21, because verse 21 says, as coals are to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. So you see, this is actually fresh fuel being added to a fire that's dying down. And of course now it sparks and spits and roars afresh. The Jerusalem Bible, I think, captures the sense of the proverb when it says this: in a very cryptic way, charcoal for live embers, wood for fire, for kindling strife, a quarrelsome man. So you see, this is not the whisperer now. This is a person who's much more open in their actions. They don't need to go around secretly whispering things in the ecclesia. They love to bring it right out into the open. They love a discussion, except somehow it's never a discussion, it's always a battle. The truth's always about conflict. Everything must be debated in the spirit of argument. There must be confrontation. These are the diehards of ecclesial life, the battlers who won't have a bar of this or that or this group or that group or whatever. And the whole spirit is one of confrontation. Ever had those in ecclesial life? That's not the spirit of Christ, is it? Fierce words, heated arguments, abrasive behaviour. The word kindle here means to glow, to incite passion. You see, the spirit of this one, the spirit of their approach, is that they stir up feelings of discontent. They don't kindle love, they stir up strife. What do you think their motive is? Chapter 28, verse 25. The contentious man that kindles strife. What's their motive? Chapter 28, verse 25 says, he that is of a proud heart stirreth up strife. But he that putteth his trust in Yahweh shall be made fat. You see, this is the person who causes trouble in the ecclesia by being a quarreller on issues. And you know, one of the remarkable things about, you see, by their fruits ye shall know them. You can always tell these people by their fruits. Their fruits are evident. They are never the champions of reconciliation. They are never the champions of healing and restoring and binding and bringing back together again. They're the people who delight in exploding apart things. And their fruits are such that, well, they're not known, really, for much success at all, apart from igniting controversy. Wise rulers know that that spirit never ever best advances the cause of the truth. It doesn't honour the Father, and it doesn't fulfil his purpose. So they watch for those people, and they avoid that spirit in their own lives. Verse 22, as our time has gone. The words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. Actually, the word wounds here, lacham, really actually means that the basic idea of the verb is to swallow greedily. Wounds is not a good translation. The word means to swallow greedily. And so other translations render as follows. RSV says the words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels. Jerusalem Bible says tasty morsels. NIV says choice morsels. Amplified Bible says dainty morsels. And you see, now we come to the real reason why whisperers in the ecclesia are so readily heard. Because you see, everybody loves to hear a little bit of gossip about somebody else, don't we? And instead of stopping the whisperer in their tracks, they say, did you know about Brother? No. Really? And they're like, you see, it's part of the perversity of the flesh, isn't it? That, you see, we love to see other people taken down, just a peg or two. Partly because that makes us feel perhaps a peg or two higher ourselves. It's part of the reasoning of the flesh, isn't it? The trouble is, you see what it says in the verse, the trouble is that when you've swallowed the dainty morsels, as Moffat says, swallowed and relished to the full, the problem is that they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. But you may like to take a note of Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 16, which shows that the innermost parts of the belly is really a synonym for the innermost thoughts and feelings of the person. And the trouble is, you see, that such delicious morsels enter into the innermost recesses and they deeply influence our personal attitudes to one another. And the great tragedy of this verse is that our attitude to another brother or another sister could be affected by a whispered morsel of gossip or scandal, once swallowed, once relished, never forgotten. And our thinking on that person is coloured because of the morsel we swallowed from the words of the whisperer. It's a terribly dangerous thing, isn't it, brother? You know how powerful whisperers are? Chapter 16 of Proverbs and verse 28. I'll show you how powerful they are. Proverbs 16:28. A froward man soweth strife, and a whisperer separateth chief friends. Even the closest and dearest of friends in the truth can be cut asunder by the words of such people in ecclesial life. Oh, how we should avoid that spirit. So there we have it. You see, the troublemakers of these verses. The meddler of verse 17, the jester of verse 18, the whisperer of verse 20, and the quarreller of verse 21. Those that are the troublemakers in ecclesial life. We need to be careful and aware of those dangers, not only in others, but especially in ourselves, so that we might in all that we do, as wise kings, advance best the cause of the truth.